The old wooden box, hidden for over a century beneath the loose floorboards of the forgotten Winfield house, was a relic that defied all logic and expectation, a solid, heavy truth where before there had only been the wispy fabric of campus legend and the dismissive chuckles of tenured historians who believed every secret of the past had already been catalogued and digitized. Its mystery stripped away by modern scholarship. For me, Leo, a graduate student buried under a mountain of student debt and the crushing weight of academic mediocrity, the discovery felt like a seismic event, a personal earthquake that shattered the boring, predictable path my life was on and offered instead a tantalizing glimpse into a shadowy corridor of history that promised not just a groundbreaking thesis, but an adventure. A purpose far greater than simply pleasing my perpetually unimpressed advisor, Dr. Albright, who had all but told me my chosen topic on logistical supply chains in the Mexican-American War was destined to gather dust on a library shelf, unread and unremembered. The legend of Old Fuss and Feathers Folly, the apocryphal secret strategy of General Winfield Scott, the grand old hero of the war, was something we history majors whispered about after one too many coffees, a ghost story for adults, a comforting myth that suggested that even in the age of telegraphs and newspapers, some truths could remain buried, waiting for the right person to unearth them, and now, kneeling on the rough, dusty floorboards of this abandoned house that had once belonged to a distant relative of the general himself, I felt a dizzying sense of destiny, as if the threads of time had conspired to lead me here, to this specific spot, on this specific afternoon, because the secret was finally ready to be told. The air in the attic was thick, hot, and heavy with the smell of centuries-old dust, dry rot, and the faint, sweet scent of decaying paper, a perfume of forgotten times that filled my lungs with every nervous breath I took as I worked the crowbar into the narrow gap between the floorboards, my hands slick with sweat despite the cool autumn air seeping through the broken windowpane across the room. The house itself, a decaying Victorian monstrosity on the edge of the university town, had been scheduled for demolition, and my presence there was technically trespassing, a fact that added a sharp, metallic edge of fear to the thrilling pulse of excitement coursing through me. I had only this one chance, this one desperate raid into the past before bulldozers reduced Winfield House to a pile of splinters and memories, erasing any last chance of finding the fabled box. When the floorboard finally gave way with a groan that echoed like a ghostly sigh through the empty rooms below, revealing the dark, cramped space beneath, and my flashlight beam landed on the stark, angular shape of the box, my heart simply stopped for a second, then resumed with a frantic, pounding rhythm that roared in my ears. It was real, the stories were true, and in that moment, every risk, every moment of doubt, felt worth it. The box itself was unadorned, made of a dark, heavy wood like mahogany, its surface scarred and splintered by time and confinement, and the iron latch was a thick, simple mechanism now crusted with a brittle skin of orange rust that flaked away under my trembling touch as I tried to pry it open, the metal cold and unforgiving against my skin, a last stubborn guardian of the secret within. After several agonizing minutes of struggling, the latch finally yielded with a sharp, metallic crack that sounded unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the attic, a sound that seemed to finalize something, to break a seal not just on a container but on history itself, and I held my breath as I slowly, carefully, lifted the creaking lid, half expecting to find nothing but dust and disappointment. The ultimate academic joke played by a long-dead general. But there was no joke, only a single, thick document, a large sheet of parchment, or heavy paper, folded over and over upon itself into a dense, compact square that felt surprisingly heavy and solid in my hands, like a brick of pure history. I carried this precious, terrifying object to the lone window, a grimy portal looking out onto the overgrown garden and the fading light of the late afternoon, the weak, golden sunbeams struggling through the dirt and cobwebs to provide just enough illumination to see by, and there, with the utmost care, as if handling a holy relic, I began the delicate process of unfolding it. The paper crackling and protesting with every movement, its fibers stiff and brittle with age, threatening to tear along the sharp, well-worn creases that mapped its long confinement. As it lay fully open before me, spread across the dusty floorboards, I saw it was not a map of a famous battlefield like Chapultepec or the Valley of Mexico, which would have been the logical focus of a secret strategy from Scott, but instead a detailed, meticulously hand-drawn chart of a coastline, a specific section of the Gulf of Mexico. focusing on the port of Veracruz but extending far beyond it to include a series of unnamed coves, inlets, and a particular, prominently circled area, labeled Whisper Bay. This was not a standard military map for troop movements. It was a navigational chart, but one annotated with a bizarre and cryptic series of symbols. A small, precise anchor drawn next to a secluded beach, a crescent moon hovering over a particular stretch of deep water, a stylized, unblinking eye position near a coastal village, and a dotted line that traced a route not for an entire invasion fleet, but for what appeared to be a single, fast ship, weaving a clandestine path up the coast, avoiding the main shipping lanes. The title, scrawled across the top in the faded brown ink of a bygone era, was what truly stole my breath. Operation Serpent's Tooth, the true route to Veracruz and the means of absolute victory. My mind reeled. Veracruz was the site of Scott's famous and brilliantly executed amphibious landing in 1847, the largest such operation in U.S. history until World War II, a victory that was the textbook definition of a conventional military success, the cornerstone of his fame. But this map, this Operation Serpent's Tooth, suggested that everything we knew, everything written in the history books, was an elaborate facade, a public performance designed to hide a much darker, more complex truth that happened in the shadows. What was this absolute victory, and why did it require such secrecy? The phrase written in a different, shakier, and more hurried script in the bottom margin, as if added later in a moment of fear or urgency, deepened the mystery exponentially. The victory was not in the landing, but in the silence that followed. The war was won before the first shot was fired, the enemy rotted from within. God forgive us the means. The words were chilling, suggesting not a glorious battle but a covert operation, an act of subterfuge or sabotage so profound it guaranteed the outcome of the entire war from the very beginning, a concept that turned the entire narrative of the conflict on its head and hinted at a moral compromise so severe it required a plea for divine forgiveness. This was no simple strategy. It was a confession, a burden placed on parchment, and now that burden was mine to carry, to understand. The historical implications were staggering, enough to rewrite chapters of history, but the personal implications for me, a nobody student, were equally immense, offering a chance at redemption, fame, and maybe even enough financial reward from a book deal to escape my debts forever. I was so utterly absorbed in the map, my face inches from the parchment, tracing the route to Whisper Bay, with my finger, imagining the silent ship moving like a ghost through the night, that I almost missed the subtle detail that would change everything, the detail that transformed this historical puzzle into immediate, personal danger. There, nestled in the intricate swirls of the hand-drawn compass rose in the corner of the map, was a small, faint but undeniably modern pencil mark, a tiny, precise question mark. It wasn't faded or yellowed, it was gray and fresh, a mark made by a contemporary pencil, and it was placed directly next to the symbol of the eye near Whisper Bay. The realization hit me like a physical blow, a cold wave of dread that washed away the warm excitement of discovery in an instant. I was not the first. Someone else had been here, in this attic, had found this box, had opened this map, and had left this mark, a silent testament to their own curiosity and their own presence. The attic, which moments before had felt like a sacred, private vault, now felt like a stage, and I was an actor who had stumbled into a play that was already underway, a play whose script I did not know. The shadows, once just empty space, now seemed to pulse with potential threat, every dark corner a hiding place, every stack of old furniture a possible witness. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, waiting silence, a vacuum begging to be filled. And then, as if my fear had summoned it, the sound came, a low, deliberate, and unmistakably heavy footstep on the wooden staircase below, the fifth step from the top. The one I knew creaked loudly because it had creaked under my own weight not an hour ago. My blood ran cold. I froze, not even daring to breathe, my eyes locked on the attic door at the top of the stairs. The footstep was followed by another, then another, a slow, methodical ascent that was in no hurry. The sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had every right to be there. This was not campus security. Their steps were quick and careless. This was something else. Someone who moved with a purpose as dark and heavy as the secret I now held in my hands. The doorknob, an old, tarnished brass fixture, began to turn, not with a quick jerk, but with a slow, grating squeal of metal on metal that seemed to last for an eternity, the sound of my sanctuary being violated, my discovery being threatened, and my life potentially being thrown into a danger I could never have imagined when I first decided to break into a forgotten old house looking for a ghost story. The slow, grating squeal of the tarnished brass doorknob turning felt like a sound that was tearing directly through the fabric of my own reality, a noise so laden with menace and finality that it seemed to freeze the very dust motes dancing in the slanted, late afternoon sunbeams piercing the grimy attic window, holding me and the entire decaying world of Winfield House in a state of suspended, breathless animation. My heart, which had been pounding a frantic, excited rhythm just moments before as I deciphered the cryptic clues on General Winfield Scott's hidden map, now felt like a trapped, wild animal trying to batter its way out of my ribcage, each thunderous beat echoing the slow, deliberate turn of that knob, a horrifying countdown to a confrontation I was utterly unprepared for. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to hide, to do something, but my body was locked in place, a statue of pure fear, my fingers still pressed against the cold, rough parchment of the map, the phrases, Operation Serpent's Tooth, and one before the first shot was fired, burning in my mind with new, terrifying significance. Was this the consequence of that long-ago silence, reaching its cold hand forward through time to touch me? The map was no longer just a historical curiosity, it had become a dangerous object, a magnet for a threat I couldn't see, and the modern pencil mark, that tiny, accusing question mark next to the drawn eye, was proof that I was not navigating the past alone, that someone else was on this trail, someone who had likely left that mark as a taunt or a warning, and was now returning to claim their prize. The squealing stopped, leaving a silence that was somehow even more terrifying, a vacuum of sound that was broken only by the frantic, ragged sound of my own breathing, which I desperately tried to stifle, pressing my lips together until they hurt, my eyes wide and fixed on the thin line of darkness appearing between the door and its frame. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second an agony of anticipation. I could feel the rough texture of the wooden floorboards digging into my knees, smell the overpowering scent of old dust and my own cold sweat, see every detail of the attic with a hyperreal, nightmarish clarity, the stacked furniture shrouded in white sheets like silent ghosts, the towering piles of mildewed books, the rusty trunk in the corner. All potential hiding places that now seemed impossibly far away. My mind raced through a frantic, disjointed catalogue of possibilities. Was it a security guard, a fellow historian who had been tracking the same legend, or something far worse, someone for whom this secret was not academic but vital, someone who would kill to protect it or to possess it? The door began to swing inward, not with a sudden burst, but with a slow, inexorable push that was infinitely more threatening, revealing first a sliver of the dark, gloomy hallway beyond, then a worn leather shoe, then the edge of a dark coat. I had to move. Survival instinct finally overrode paralyzing fear. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like an electric shock, I scrambled backwards on my hands and knees, the map crinkling loudly in my grip, a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. I ducked behind the nearest large object, a massive, sheet-draped shape that felt like a grand piano or a large desk, pulling my knees to my chest and trying to make myself as small as possible, the coarse white fabric of the sheets smelling of damp and neglect. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, praying I hadn't been seen, listening as the door swung fully open and those heavy, deliberate footsteps entered the attic. The footsteps paused just inside the doorway, and I could feel a presence in the room, a shift in the atmosphere, a coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I dared to peer through a narrow gap between the sheet and the floor, my view limited to a slice of the room near the window where I had just been standing. The man who entered was not anyone I recognized from the university. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long, dark overcoat that seemed out of place for the season, and his movements were fluid, economical, radiating a quiet, professional confidence that was far more frightening than any show of aggression. He didn't call out or search frantically. He simply stood there, his head turning slowly as he scanned the room, taking in every detail with a calm, analytical gaze that missed nothing. His eyes, what I could see of them from my hiding place, were pale and cold, and they passed over my hiding place once, then twice, and my heart felt like it would stop altogether. But his gaze lingered on the spot by the window, on the exposed floorboard I had pried up, the empty space where the box had been. He walked over to it, his footsteps unnervingly quiet on the bare floor now, and knelt down, running a gloved hand over the rough edges of the hole. He knew. He knew exactly what he was looking for and exactly where it should have been. He remained there for a long moment, perfectly still, and I could almost feel his cold anger, his disappointment. Then, he stood up and turned, his gaze sweeping the attic again, and this time, it felt different, more predatory, more focused. He knew the map was still here. He knew I was still here. He began to move, not with haste, but with a terrifying patience, methodically checking behind stacks of boxes, pushing aside draped furniture with a quiet, relentless efficiency. He was working his way across the room, a human search grid, and it was only a matter of seconds before he reached the piano desk I was hiding behind. The map was still clutched in my hand, a brittle, accusing rectangle of paper. I had to get it out of here. I had to get myself out of here. My eyes darted around, looking for any escape route. The window was my only chance, a risky, likely painful drop to the overgrown garden below, but it was better than being cornered. But to reach it, I would have to cross an open space, directly in his line of sight. I was trapped. The footsteps were closer now, just on the other side of the sheet. I could hear the soft rustle of his coat. I held my breath, pressing myself harder against the dusty wood, feeling the rough grain through my thin shirt. This was it. He would pull back the sheet and find me cowering there, a terrified student with a stolen secret. But then, a miracle, or a diversion. From downstairs, faint but clear, came the sound of the front door being pushed open, followed by a voice calling out, "Hello? Campus security! Anyone in here? We've had a report of a trespasser." It was the security guard, doing his evening rounds, his voice bored and routine. The man in the attic froze. His head turned sharply towards the sound from the staircase. I saw a flicker of annoyance, of recalculated plans, cross his impassive face. He was not here for a confrontation with authority. He was here for the map, and now his window of opportunity was closing. He shot one last, sweeping look around the attic, his cold eyes seeming to pierce right through the sheet I was hiding behind, as if he were imprinting the scene on his memory. Then, with a speed that was startling after his previous deliberate pace, he moved not towards the staircase, but towards a shadowy corner of the attic I hadn't noticed before, where a small, square hatch was set into the wall, a servant's access to the roof, perhaps. He opened it with a quiet, practiced motion and slipped through, pulling it shut behind him without a sound. I remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds of the security guard shuffling around downstairs, calling out again with diminishing interest. The attic was silent once more, but the silence was now filled with the ghost of the man's presence, the lingering chill of his threat. I waited until I heard the front door slam shut downstairs, the security guard having given up his cursory search. Only then did I let out a shuddering breath, my entire body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. I slowly, painfully, unfolded myself from behind the desk, my muscles stiff and aching. The map was still safe in my hand, though now crumpled from my desperate grip. I looked at it again, but its meaning had changed completely. It was no longer a path to academic glory. It was a key to a door behind which lay real, tangible danger. The man in the dark coat was proof that Operation Serpent's Tooth was not a forgotten relic. It was a live wire, a secret that still had power, still had guardians, or pursuers. And I, Leo, a broke graduate student, was now hopelessly, terrifyingly entangled in it. I had to get out of this house. I carefully folded the map, my hands shaking so badly it was a struggle to replicate the original creases, and I slipped it inside my shirt, against my skin, where it felt like it was burning a brand of fear and obsession onto my soul. I crept to the attic door, listening intently, then slipped out and down the creaking staircase, every sound making me jump. I didn't stop running until I was 3 blocks away, lost in the safe, normal bustle of students heading to dinner, the warm, electric lights of the campus a stark contrast to the gloomy darkness of Winfield House. But even surrounded by life and noise, I couldn't shake the feeling of those cold, pale eyes, or the terrifying certainty that this was only the very beginning, that the silence surrounding Winfield Scott's secret had been broken, and I was now at the center of a storm that had been brewing for over a century, a storm I was utterly unprepared to weather. A storm that had already found me and would not let me go until I had uncovered every last one of its dark, buried truths, no matter the cost. The terrifying certainty that I was now at the center of a storm that had been brewing for over a century, a storm I was utterly unprepared to weather, a storm that had already found me and would not let me go until I had uncovered every last one of its dark, buried truths, no matter the cost, settled over me not as a fleeting panic but as a cold, heavy, and permanent weight in my chest. A lodestone of dread that seemed to pull at my very soul with every step I took away from the decaying silhouette of Winfield House and into the deceptive normalcy of the brightly lit campus pathways. The map, now hidden against the skin of my chest under my shirt, felt less like a piece of paper and more like a live coal, its heat a constant, searing reminder of the danger it carried, a physical connection to the pale-eyed man in the dark coat whose silent, predatory presence was now burned into my memory, a ghost I knew was not gone but merely waiting, recalculating in the shadows. The sounds of laughing students, the distant thump of music from a fraternity house, the cheerful jingle of a bike bell, all the familiar soundtrack of my life, now seemed like a thin, fragile veneer painted over a much darker, more dangerous reality, a reality where historical secrets were not just academic puzzles but lethal commodities, and where a forgotten general's choices could reach out from the grave to threaten a nobody like me. My mind was a chaotic whirlwind, replaying every second in the attic on a frantic, terrifying loop, the feel of the rough floorboards, the crackle of the parchment, the shocking discovery of the modern question mark, and then the slow, squealing turn of the doorknob, a sound that would surely haunt my dreams for the rest of my life, however short that might now be. Who was he? A descendant of someone involved in Operation Serpent's Tooth, tasked with guarding the secret? A rival researcher who would stop at nothing to claim the discovery for himself? Or something far more sinister, an agent of some organization, public or private, that had a vested interest in keeping this particular chapter of history buried? The phrase, "the enemy rotted from within," suggested a betrayal so deep it had won a war, an act of such profound deception that its exposure, even 170 years later, could have unimaginable consequences, could topple reputations, rewrite national narratives, perhaps even unsettle delicate modern political relationships between the US and Mexico. The weight of that possibility was crushing, and the thought that I, Leo, was now the sole person outside of that shadowy man who knew of this potential historical earthquake was enough to make my knees feel weak as I stumbled towards the only place that offered a semblance of safety and sanity. My tiny, cluttered graduate student apartment on the edge of campus. Every shadow between the buildings seemed to hold a potential threat. Every person walking towards me was subjected to a frantic, surreptitious scrutiny, my heart skipping a beat each time I saw a tall figure or a dark coat, my paranoia growing with every step until I was practically running by the time I reached my building, fumbling with my keys with trembling, sweat-slicked hands, dropping them twice on the grimy linoleum of the stairwell before finally managing to unlock my door and throw myself inside, slamming it shut and engaging both the deadbolt and the chain lock with a series of clicks that sounded like the ceiling of a tomb that I was now entombed within, along with my dangerous new companion. I stood for a long moment with my back pressed against the door, listening for any sound from the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my entire body shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline that had fueled my escape finally began to ebb, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a fear so potent it had a taste, a metallic, coppery flavor of pure panic at the back of my throat. The apartment was dark and quiet, the only light coming from the neon sign of the pizza place across the street, casting shifting red and blue hues across the stacks of books and the piles of dirty laundry that constituted my life. It was a mess, but it was my mess, a familiar chaos that now felt like the last outpost of my old, simple existence, an existence that had ended the moment I lifted that mahogany box from its hiding place. I finally pushed myself away from the door and stumbled to the small kitchenette. Pouring a large glass of water with hands that still shook so violently I spilled half of it on the counter, the cold liquid a minor shock that helped ground me slightly. I then carefully, reverently, as if handling a sacred yet cursed object, withdrew the map from inside my shirt. It was warm from my body heat, and the creases where I had refolded it were fresh and sharp, contrasting with the ancient, brittle folds that had been made over a century ago. I cleared a space on my small desk, pushing aside textbooks on military history and half-written thesis chapters, and gently smoothed the map open under the glow of my desk lamp. In the safe, controlled light, the details were even more striking, and even more confusing. The coastline was definitely the Gulf of Mexico, with Veracruz clearly marked, but the focus on Whisper Bay was puzzling. It wasn't a name that appeared on any modern map or in any of the historical accounts I'd devoured for my research. It had to be an old name, a local name, or perhaps a code name for the operation. The symbols were the real mystery. The anchor, the crescent moon, the eye. They weren't standard cartographic symbols. They felt more like a personal code, a cipher used by Scott or his co-conspirators to communicate key points without writing them down. The anchor could signify a safe landing spot, a place for a ship to drop anchor unseen. The crescent moon? A time? A specific phase of the moon for a rendezvous? And the eye, that was the most unsettling. Surveillance? A lookout? Or something more metaphorical, like the eye of God, watching over, or judging, their actions. And then there was the pencil mark, that tiny, fresh question mark next to the eye. I leaned in close, my nose almost touching the paper, examining it under the bright light. It was definitely graphite, and it was light, as if drawn with a hard pencil, a 2H or maybe a 4H, the kind used for precise drafting or, I realized with a chill, for making subtle notations on documents without leaving a permanent, obtrusive mark. This wasn't the hasty scrawl of a curious student. This was the mark of a professional, someone who was methodically analyzing the map, just as I was. He had questioned the eye. Did he not know what it meant? Or was he questioning its placement? Its purpose? This small mark was a terrifying form of communication, a silent message from my unknown adversary that said, "I have been here. I am also working on this puzzle. And I am ahead of you. I needed help. I couldn't do this alone." My first instinct was to call Dr. Albright, my advisor, but I immediately dismissed it. His rigid, by-the-book approach to history would never accept such a wild, unsubstantiated story. He'd likely demand I turn the map over to the university archives immediately, and the moment it entered an official system, it would be lost to me forever, and worse, it might alert the man in the dark coat to its new location, putting others in danger. I thought of my fellow graduate students, but they were rivals as much as friends, all competing for the same grants and accolades. I couldn't trust them with something this monumental. There was only one person I could think of, someone who lived in the gray areas of history, who thrived on mysteries and conspiracies, and who, most importantly, had the skills to help me without immediately going to the authorities, Professor Eris Thorne. Thorne was a campus legend, a historian emeritus who had been pushed to the fringes of the department decades ago for his unorthodox theories about everything from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln to the true origins of the Cold War. He was considered a brilliant but eccentric crackpot by most, a man who saw patterns where others saw chaos. He had taken a liking to me during an undergraduate seminar, seeing in my restless curiosity a kindred spirit, and we had kept in touch, meeting occasionally for coffee where he would hold forth on his latest theories with a twinkle in his eye. He was the only person I knew who wouldn't laugh me out of the room, who would understand the gravity of the find, and who might have the knowledge to help me decipher it. It was late, but I knew Thorne was a notorious night owl, often doing his best work in the small hours of the morning. I grabbed my phone, my fingers still unsteady, and scrolled through my contacts until I found his number. It rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice a dry, raspy whisper that always sounded like it was coated in dust from old books. "Leo? To what do I owe the pleasure of a call at this ungodly hour? Finally decided my theory about Zapata's lost gold was more interesting than Albright's supply chains." I tried to keep my voice calm, but it cracked with tension. "Professor Thorne, I need your help. I've found something big. And I think I'm in trouble." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, The playful tone was gone, replaced by a sharp, serious intensity. What kind of something? A map, I said, my eyes fixed on the yellowed parchment. A map belonging to Winfield Scott. It details something called Operation Serpent's Tooth. It claims the war was won before the first shot was fired. The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath. Winfield Scott? Serpent's Tooth? Good God. Where are you? Don't move. Don't talk to anyone. I'm coming over. Now. He hung up before I could say another word. His reaction, so immediate and so grave, confirmed my deepest fears and my wildest hopes. He knew something. The name meant something to him. I had been right to call him. The 20 minutes it took for Thorn to arrive felt like 20 hours. I spent them pacing my small apartment, jumping at every creak from the old building, my eyes constantly darting to the window, half expecting to see the pale-eyed man staring up at me from the street below. When a firm, rapid knock finally came at my door, I nearly screamed. I peered through the peephole to see Thorn's familiar, gaunt face, his wild shock of white hair looking like he'd just been electrocuted, his eyes wide behind his thick glasses. I unlocked the door, and he slipped inside quickly, as if evading pursuit himself. He was carrying a large, worn leather satchel bulging with books and files. He didn't even say hello. His eyes went straight to the map spread out on my desk. He moved towards it like a man drawn to a magnet, his breath catching in his throat. "Let me see," he whispered, his voice full of awe. He leaned over the desk, his long, bony fingers hovering just above the parchment, not daring to touch it. He studied it in silence for a full 5 minutes, his eyes tracing every line, every symbol, every word. He muttered to himself. "Veracruz, yes, of course, but Whisper Bay. I knew it, the anchor, the moon, and the eye. My God, the eye." He finally straightened up and turned to me, his face pale and grim. "Leo, what you have here, this is not just a historical document. This is a bomb. A historical thermonuclear bomb. Where did you find it?" I told him everything, from the campus legend to the hidden floorboard, leaving out no detail, especially not the part about the man in the dark coat. As I described the confrontation in the attic, Thorn's expression grew even more serious. He nodded slowly, as if this was an expected, though dreaded, development. "You've stumbled into a very old, very deep game, my boy," he said, his voice low. "Operation Serpent's Tooth. I've seen references to it, fragments, hints in private letters and coded diaries from junior officers who seemed haunted by something they'd witnessed but couldn't speak of. It was always dismissed as campfire gossip, the kind of rumor that springs up around any major military campaign. But I always believed there was something to it. Scott was a brilliant strategist, but the speed and totality of his victory in Mexico, it never quite added up. The enemy command structure seemed to collapse from the inside, their communications in disarray, their key fortifications undermined by inexplicable acts of sabotage or surrender. The official history chalks it up to American martial superiority and Mexican political instability. But this, he pointed a trembling finger at the map. This suggests it was by design. A deliberate, covert operation to decapitate the Mexican command before the war even properly began. But what was it? I asked, my voice desperate. What does Serpent's Tooth mean? And who was the man in the attic? Thorn paced my small room, his mind racing. The name is from Shakespeare. King Lear. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. It's about betrayal, Leo. A betrayal from within the family, from someone who owes you loyalty. Scott didn't just defeat the Mexican army, he turned someone, a key someone, against their own side. This map isn't a battle plan, it's an infiltration route. This ship, he traced the dotted line. It didn't carry soldiers. It carried a single passenger. A weapon. A person. Someone who was delivered to Whisper Bay to be inserted into the heart of the Mexican command. The eye symbol, that could be the operative. The one who would be the eye inside the enemy's camp. The one who would rot them from within. The theory was breathtaking in its audacity. A single spy, a turncoat of such high value that their betrayal could win a war. It made a terrifying kind of sense. But who? I whispered. Thorne shook his head. That is the billion-dollar question. The identity of that operative was the secret that had to be protected at all costs. If it was revealed, it would not only rewrite history, it would destroy the legacy of an American hero. Scott would be seen not as a brilliant general but as a master of deceit. And for the operative's descendants, if there are any, the shame would be immense. Or, he added, his eyes narrowing, the power. If this operative was rewarded, their family could have grown powerful and wealthy, a power built on a secret. A secret they would have a vested interest in protecting, even today. The pale-eyed man. Could he be a descendant? A guardian of a dark family legacy? What do we do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed. Thorne stopped pacing and looked at me, his gaze intense. We do what historians do. We follow the evidence. First, we need to identify Whisper Bay, its modern name. Then, we need to cross-reference Scott's official correspondence around the time of the Veracruz landing with any anomalies, any unexplained absences, any cryptic mentions. We need to look into the Mexican commanders, see if any of them behaved erratically, if any of them had aides or advisors who mysteriously disappeared. And we need to be incredibly, exquisitely careful. The man who found you in the attic knows you have the map. He will be looking for you. He will assume you will start digging. Your computer, your phone, your library searches, they may all be monitored. The scope of the undertaking was staggering, and the danger was palpable. But looking at the map, at the mysterious symbols and the haunting words, God forgive us the means, I knew there was no turning back. The storm had me, and the only way out was through the heart of it. Thorne and I spent the next several hours in a feverish state of research, surrounded by books and hunched over our laptops, the map lying between us like a silent, demanding oracle, its secrets slowly, painfully beginning to yield their first, terrifying fragments under the relentless pressure of our investigation. An investigation that was no longer about academic credit but about survival and the uncovering of a truth that had been buried for generations, a truth that was now, finally, stirring from its long slumber and reaching out to pull us into its dark and violent embrace. The truth, a monstrous, slumbering leviathan of a secret that had been buried for generations under the weight of official history and deliberate silence, was now, finally, stirring from its long rest, and with its awakening came a cold, violent embrace that pulled Professor Thorne and me headlong into a labyrinth of shadows and consequences far darker and more intricate than anything my academic mind could have ever conceived, transforming my cluttered, book-strewn apartment from a safe haven into a command center for a desperate, clandestine operation that felt as fraught with peril as the one detailed on the fragile map spread between us. The initial feverish hours of research bled into the deep, silent heart of the night, the neon glow from the pizza place across the street fading as the establishment closed, plunging my room into a gloom broken only by the harsh blue light of our laptop screens and the warm, focused pool of illumination from my desk lamp falling directly onto the parchment, making the faded ink of Winfield Scott's hand seem to pulse with a faint spectral energy. Thorne, fueled by a lifetime of chasing historical ghosts and a potent mixture of black coffee and sheer intellectual adrenaline, was a whirlwind of cross-referencing and muttered conjectures, his long fingers flying across his keyboard, pulling up digitized archives, private letter collections, and obscure regional histories with a speed that belied his age. I was tasked with the more granular work, scouring high-resolution satellite maps of the Mexican Gulf Coast, trying to match the unique, hook-shaped peninsula and the specific depth soundings marked near Whisper Bay with any modern geographical feature, a painstaking process of comparing 19th-century cartography with 21st-century technology. Feeling the atmosphere in the room was thick with a palpable tension, a mixture of thrilling discovery and gnawing fear. Every creak from the old apartment building's pipes or groan of the floorboards from the tenant above made us both freeze, our eyes meeting in a shared moment of panic, listening intently for the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps on the stairs, expecting at any moment for the pale-eyed man to kick down my flimsy door and reclaim his prize. Thorne had insisted we take rudimentary security precautions. We used a secure, encrypted messaging app to communicate any findings we didn't want to say aloud, and we kept the physical map covered with a blank sheet of paper when not actively studying it, as if the very act of looking at it might broadcast our location to our unseen adversary. "The key is the timeline," Thorne rasped, not looking up from his screen, his face bathed in the monitor's glow. "Scott's main fleet departed from New Orleans and made landfall at Veracruz on March 9, 1847. But this map, this route is for a single, fast ship, a schooner or a cutter, something that could navigate close to shore and avoid detection. It could have left earlier, much earlier. We need to find a gap in the record, an unaccounted for vessel, or a period where Scott himself was curiously absent from the official logs." He was right. We were no longer just historians. We were detectives investigating a cold case that was suddenly, terrifyingly, hot again. My own search for Whisper Bay was proving frustrating. The coastline had changed over nearly 2 centuries, with shifting sands, erosion, and modern development obscuring the landmarks Scott's cartographer had so carefully recorded. I was about to voice my frustration when Thorne let out a sharp, triumphant hiss, a sound like steam escaping a kettle. "Leo, look at this," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. He turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was a scanned page from a digitized ledger of naval movements from the port of Tampico, dated late January 1847. "It's a log entry for a private vessel, the Sea Nymph, cleared for coastal survey work under a letter of marque from the War Department. The captain's name is listed as A.J. W. Smythe." He pointed a bony finger at the screen. "Nothing remarkable there, lots of private ships were used for reconnaissance. But look at the destination." My eyes scanned the spidery cursive. The listed destination was Bahia del Sussurro. My Spanish was rudimentary, but I knew enough. "Bahia del Sussurro," I whispered. "Bay of the Whisper. Whisper Bay." We had found it. The name was real. It was an old, local name for a small, secluded inlet about 50 miles south of Tampico, a place that had been largely forgotten by modern maps, which now labeled the area as part of a larger, more generic coastal region. My hands shaking with a fresh surge of adrenaline, I pulled up the satellite imagery for those coordinates. And there it was. Just as Scott's map had depicted, a hook-shaped peninsula curled protectively around a deep, sheltered bay, hidden from the open sea. It was perfect for a clandestine landing. "The Sea Nymph," I breathed, my eyes darting between the satellite image and the ancient map. It was the ship. It delivered the weapon to Whisper Bay. Thorne was already diving deeper, his fingers a blur. "J.W. Smythe, let's see who he was." A few minutes of searching through maritime records and officer rolls yielded a tantalizingly brief biography. Captain Josiah William Smythe, a former Royal Navy officer who had emigrated to the United States and specialized in delicate maritime operations. He was known for his discretion and his loyalty to Scott. But it was a footnote, a single line in an obscure biography, that sent a jolt of electricity through us both. Smythe's log from the Sea Nymph's voyage in early 1847 is notably missing from the National Archives, listed as lost in transit in 1892. Lost in transit. Or deliberately removed. We were on the right track. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the central mystery remained. Who was the passenger? Who was the serpent's tooth? The thankless child who betrayed Mexico? Thorne leaned back, stroking his chin, his eyes distant. The betrayal had to come from the very top. To cause the level of disarray that Scott benefited from, it had to be someone within Santa Anna's inner circle, someone with access to strategic plans, deployment schedules, communication codes. Santa Anna, the flamboyant, controversial president and generalissimo of Mexico. His court was famously fractious, full of rivalries and ambition. An aide-de-camp? I suggested. A senior advisor? Perhaps, Thorne murmured. But the phrase thankless child is so specific. It implies a familial bond, or at least a bond of deep loyalty that was severed. What if it was closer than an aide? What if it was a family member? The idea was shocking. You think Scott turned one of Santa Anna's own relatives? It's a possibility, Thorne said, his voice low. Santa Anna was a narcissist, a man who surrounded himself with sycophants, but he trusted his blood. There are stories, rumors, About a nephew, a favorite nephew, who served on his staff. A young, idealistic officer named, let me think. He closed his eyes, digging into the vast archives of his memory. Alvaro de Santa Anna y Garcia. He was present at the Battle of Cerro Gordo, where Scott outmaneuvered Santa Anna so perfectly it was as if he knew his every move. After the war, Alvaro disappeared from the historical record. It was assumed he died in the conflict or went into exile. He opened his eyes, and they were blazing with a new light. What if he didn't die? What if he was the price? What if Scott, through some means of coercion or promise, turned Alvaro, used him as his eye inside the Mexican High Command, and then, after the war, helped him disappear, giving him a new identity, a new life in the United States as a reward for his betrayal? The theory was breathtaking. It explained the totality of the victory, the phrase, brought it from within, and the need for absolute secrecy. Exposing this would not only tarnish Winfield Scott's legacy but would be a devastating blow to Mexican national pride, revealing that one of their most humiliating defeats was orchestrated by a traitor from within the heart of the ruling family. The thankless child was not just a metaphor, it was literal. The weight of this possibility settled over the room, thick and suffocating. This was no longer just about winning a war. It was about a profound, personal betrayal that had shaped the destiny of two nations. And the man in the dark coat, if he was a descendant of this Alvaro, protecting the secret of his ancestors' shameful fortune, or a descendant of someone wronged by the betrayal, his determination to suppress this truth made a horrifying sense. Our investigation was now a race against an enemy who understood the stakes far better than we did. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through my window, painting the room in shades of lead and ash, Thorne and I, exhausted but buzzing with a nervous energy, had assembled a fragile, terrifying hypothesis. Operation Serpent's Tooth was a covert mission to land Captain Smythe and his mysterious passenger, potentially Alvaro de Santa Anna y Garcia, at Whisper Bay, from where the operative would make his way to Santa Anna's headquarters and begin his work of sabotage and deception. The success of the operation had been so complete that its very existence had been erased, and the truth buried with the participants. But one family, somewhere, had kept the secret, and they knew we were getting close. The storm was no longer on the horizon. We were now fully in its grip, and the eye of that storm was a forgotten bay on the Mexican coast and a betrayal so deep its echoes were still being felt, still demanding silence, still willing to kill to protect the bloody, shameful truth of how war was truly won. The map on the desk was no longer just a historical artifact. It was a battlefield, and the war for its secret was just beginning. The war for the secret of Operation Serpent's Tooth, a conflict that had lain dormant for generations in the dusty silence of archives and the whispered fears of a single family, was indeed just beginning, and its first shots were not fired with bullets but with the quiet, desperate clicks of computer keys and the frantic turning of pages in the pale, anxious light of dawn that now seeped into my apartment, a cold, gray illumination that did nothing to dispel the profound sense of dread that had taken root in the room. A dread that was now compounded by the staggering hypothesis Professor Thorne and I had constructed, that the traitor, the Serpent's Tooth, itself, was not some faceless spy but Alvaro de Santa Anna y Garcia, the own nephew of the Mexican Generalissimo, a betrayal of blood so profound it explained the need for a secrecy that could extend its cold hand across centuries to threaten us now. The map on my desk seemed to radiate a new, more sinister energy, the dotted line from the sea to Whisper Bay now appearing not as a simple route but as a path taken by a man walking away from his nation, his family, his very identity, towards a life built on the foundation of the ultimate treachery, and the symbols of the anchor, the moon. And the eye transformed from abstract clues into a grim timeline of the anchor for the safe landing at the hidden bay, the moon for the cover of darkness under which Alvaro would have been smuggished ashore, and the unblinking eye for the operative himself, the watcher within the enemy's camp, seeing all and betraying all. "We have to be methodical, Leo, and we have to be ghosts," Thorne whispered, his voice raspy with fatigue but sharp with urgency, his eyes, magnified behind his thick glasses, scanning the digital archives he had pulled up with the frantic energy of a man who knows a tidal wave is approaching. "If this Alvaro was given a new life, there will be a trace, a financial trace. Land grants, bank deposits, a new name appearing somewhere in the aftermath of the war, a man with unexplained wealth or political connections that materialized from nowhere. Scott would have rewarded his asset handsomely. Silence of that magnitude is the most expensive commodity of all. He began cross-referencing land records from the late 1840s and early 1850s, focusing initially on Texas and Louisiana, logical places for a man with a new identity to settle, a place where his Mexican background might be less conspicuous or even advantageous in the tumultuous post-war years. I, meanwhile, took on the task of digging deeper into the fate of Alvaro de Santa Anna y Garcia, searching for any fragmentary mention of him in Mexican sources, any record of his supposed death, any gap in the historical narrative that might align with the timeline of the Sea Nymph's voyage. The work was slow, painstaking, and felt agonizingly public. Every search query I typed into the university's library database felt like lighting a signal flare announcing our progress to the pale-eyed man, whose presence was a constant, chilling pressure at the back of my mind. After an hour of fruitless searching in the expected places, Thorne let out a low grunt of frustration. Nothing. No mysterious benefactors in New Orleans, no large land purchases by a John Smith in Texas that can't be accounted for. It's too obvious. Scott was smarter than that. He wouldn't have planted his valuable asset in plain sight. He leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. We need to think differently. Where would you hide a man who needed to disappear forever? Somewhere no one would ever think to look. Somewhere he could be protected, watched, but also where his past would be completely irrelevant. A crazy idea began to form in my sleep-deprived mind, sparked by a memory of a documentary I'd seen. What about California? I said, the words coming out in a rush. The war ended in 1848. The same year gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill. The chaos of the gold rush, it was the perfect place to disappear. Thousands of men from all over the world pouring into a territory that was still largely lawless. A man could arrive with a bag of gold and a new name, and no one would ask any questions. His past would be erased by the frenzy for the future. Thorne stared at me, and then a slow, grim smile spread across his face. Leo, that's brilliant. It's the perfect camouflage. An entire society of people reinventing themselves overnight. He swung back to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with renewed vigor, now searching through shipping manifests and early California census records from 1849 and 1850. The search parameters were vast, a digital needle in a haystack of hope and desperation. We worked in silence for another hour, the only sounds the humming of the laptops and the occasional rustle of the map as I checked a coastal detail against a modern topographical survey. The sun was fully up now, casting long, sharp shadows across the room, and the normal sounds of a weekday morning beginning outside, cars starting, students heading to class, felt like they were happening in a different, parallel universe, a world where people weren't hunted by the ghosts of 19th century conspiracies. Then Thorne froze. His entire body went rigid. He didn't speak, didn't move, his eyes glued to the screen. Thorne? I said, my voice tight with apprehension. What is it? He slowly turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a scanned image of a passenger manifest from a ship named the Pacific Star, which had sailed from Callao, Peru, to San Francisco in August of 1849. The list of names was long and faded, but one entry, about halfway down, was circled in red by Thorne's digital marker. The name listed was Alvaro Smith. My breath caught in my throat. Alvaro. And Smith, the most common of Anglo surnames, a perfect, simple translation of the Spanish Herrero or perhaps just a generic placeholder. But it was the profession listed next to the name that made my blood run cold. Military advisor. Military advisor, I whispered, the words tasting like ash. Heading to the gold rush. There were no armies in California to advise. It's a cover. It has to be. Thorne's voice was a reverent, terrified hush. Look at the port of departure. Callao, Peru. A long, circuitous route from Mexico. A way to break the trail. And look at the line below. My eyes dropped to the next entry on the manifest. The name was J.W. Smythe. Captain Josiah William Smythe, the master of the Sea Nymph, was escorting his valuable cargo to his final destination. He had delivered Alvaro to Whisper Bay, and then, after the war, he had personally shepherded him across the Pacific to a new life in the chaos of Gold Rush, California. It was a perfect, elegant, and utterly ruthless piece of tradecraft. The evidence was falling into place with a terrifying, inexorable logic. But we had to be sure. Thorne, his hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear, began searching for Alvaro Smith in the early California records. It didn't take long. We found a land deed from 1852 for a large parcel in the Sacramento Valley, purchased by one Alvaro Smith, described as a merchant. There was a record of a marriage in 1853 to a woman named Eleanor Vance, the daughter of a prominent San Francisco shipping magnate. And then, the most telling record of all, an article from the San Francisco Chronicle in 1855, reporting on the formation of the Golden Gate Trust and Banking Corporation, with its founding board members listed. Among them was Alvaro Smith. The traitorous nephew had not just been given a new identity, he had been set up with the capital to build a financial empire, to become a pillar of a new American community, his wealth and influence ensuring his silence and comfort for the rest of his days. His blood money had seeded a dynasty. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with the force of a physical blow. The pale-eyed man. He wasn't just a guardian of a secret, he was a descendant. He was protecting the foundation of his family's wealth and power, a fortune built on the most shameful betrayal imaginable. The name, Smith, would have been changed generations ago, the family evolving into something else, something powerful and established, but they would have passed down the secret, the original sin that was the source of their privilege. They were the silent partners in Winfield Scott's victory, and their reward was a legacy paid for with treason. The storm was no longer an abstract concept, it had a name, and it had a face, and it knew we were getting closer. As if on cue, my laptop, which had been sitting idle on the coffee table, suddenly chimed with an alert. It was a security notification from the university's IT system. I frowned and clicked on it. The message was brief and chilling. Multiple failed login attempts detected on your university archive account from an unrecognized IP address. Please change your password immediately. My blood ran cold. They weren't just watching, they were actively trying to break in. They were trying to see what we had already found. Thorne saw the look on my face. What is it? I showed him the screen. His face turned a shade paler. They're here, he said simply. They're digital now, but they'll be physical soon. We can't stay here, Leo. This apartment is compromised. They will have your address from your student records. The reality of our situation crashed down on me. I was a target. My home was no longer safe. The map, the manifest, our research, it was all evidence that made us a threat to a powerful, hidden enemy. Where can we go? I asked, my voice small and scared. Thorne thought for a moment, his eyes darting around my apartment as if looking for an answer. My cabin, he said finally. I have a place up in the mountains near Big Bear. It's remote, no internet, landline only. It's where I go when I need to disappear into my work. We can take everything there. We'll be off the grid. It's our only chance to stay ahead of them. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one we had. We had to move, and we had to move now. The war for the secret had entered a new, more dangerous phase, a flight into the shadows, a race to stay alive long enough to expose a truth that a family had killed to protect for over 170 years. The map on the desk was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a warrant for our own survival, and the path ahead led away from the world we knew, into a wilderness where the past was a predator hunting us through the present. The path ahead, leading away from the world we knew and into a wilderness where the past was a predator hunting us through the present, felt less like a journey and more like a frantic, desperate retreat, a scrambling flight from a threat that was no longer abstract but terrifyingly concrete, a threat that had proven its reach could extend from the physical world of a dusty attic to the digital realm of firewalls and login attempts, confirming that our adversaries were not merely a single pale eyed man but part of a sophisticated apparatus with resources and a ruthless determination that left me feeling like a rabbit caught in the open, with nowhere to run but towards the one place that offered a sliver of hope, the remote, off-grid mountain cabin that Professor Thorne called his sanctuary. The decision to leave my apartment was made in a heart-pounding rush of fear and necessity. The IT security alert was a klaxon warning us that the walls were crumbling, that our every digital move was being monitored and attacked, and it was only a matter of time, hours, perhaps minutes, before that digital pursuit turned into a physical one, before the pale-eyed man or his associates appeared at my door. Not with the quiet menace of a turning doorknob, but with the brutal finality of a kicked-in frame. "Grab only what is essential," Thorne commanded, his usual academic demeanor replaced by a grim, soldierly efficiency that was both reassuring and frightening. "The map, of course. Our notes. Laptops, but we'll need to use them sparingly, and never connected to any network. Warm clothes. It's cold in the mountains at night. We need to be ghosts, Leo. We leave no trace here." We moved through my small apartment in a frenzied ballet of packing, our movements sharp and urgent. I carefully rolled the map in a protective cylinder of acid-free paper I use for my own research documents, sealing it tightly, its physical presence in my backpack feeling like I was carrying a radioactive core. I shoved my laptop and charger into my bag, along with a jumble of clothes, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip the main compartment. Thorne, meanwhile, was methodically wiping down every surface we might have touched, using a handkerchief from his pocket, his actions those of a man who had either read too many spy novels or who understood the stakes on a level I was only beginning to comprehend. He was erasing us, turning our presence in the apartment back into the anonymous mess it had been before the map had entered our lives. Before we left, he made me send a single, carefully worded email to Dr. Albright, my advisor, from my phone, a decision he deemed less traceable than using my laptop, stating that a family emergency had come up and I would be out of communication for an indefinite period. It was a flimsy cover, but it was something, a thread of normalcy to explain my sudden disappearance from campus life. Then, we were out the door, descending the stairs not as two scholars but as fugitives, our heads on a swivel, scanning the street for any sign of a dark car, a tall figure in a coat, any anomaly in the morning routine of the neighborhood. Thorne's car, an ancient, boxy Volvo sedan that looked as dusty and forgotten as his office, was parked a block away. It was, he assured me, utterly anonymous and reliable. We threw our bags into the back seat and slid in, the act of closing the car doors feeling like sealing ourselves into a fragile metal cocoon, separate from the world but terrifyingly exposed on its roads. The drive out of the city was an exercise in sustained paranoia. Thorne drove with a calm, focused intensity, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, taking unexpected turns, doubling back on our route in a deliberate pattern designed to flush out any potential tail. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching my backpack to my chest, the cylinder containing the map digging into my ribs, a constant, painful reminder of what we were carrying. Every time a car lingered behind us for too long, every time a motorcycle filtered through traffic near us, my heart would leap into my throat. I watched the world outside the window, people buying coffee, walking dogs, living their lives, with a profound sense of alienation. Their reality was one of simple concerns. Mine had been hijacked by a conspiracy from the age of horse-drawn carriages and muskets. We drove for hours, the urban sprawl gradually giving way to suburbs, then to open highway, and finally to the winding, climbing roads that led up into the San Bernardino Mountains. The air grew cooler, the scent of pine and dry earth replacing the city's exhaust fumes. Thorne's cabin was, as promised, profoundly remote, located down a long, unpaved dirt track that seemed to lead nowhere, surrounded by a dense forest of tall pines that cast deep, shifting shadows. The cabin itself was a small, rustic structure made of dark, weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a porch that looked out over a breathtaking vista of valleys and distant, hazy peaks. It was the perfect place to hide, a fortress of solitude. Inside, it was exactly what I expected of Thorne, a single room dominated by bookshelves overflowing with volumes on every conceivable historical mystery, a large wooden table serving as a desk, a small kitchenette, and a loft bedroom accessible by a steep ladder. There was no television, no internet connection, just a single, old-fashioned rotary dial telephone on the wall that looked like a museum piece. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind in the pines and the occasional cry of a distant bird. It was both peaceful and profoundly isolating. For the first few hours, we simply decompressed, the tension of the escape slowly leaching from our bodies. We built a fire in the hearth against the growing mountain chill, and the crackling flames and the warmth they provided offered a primitive comfort. But we couldn't rest for long. The map was out on the large table, once again unfurled, its secrets demanding attention. Surrounded by the quiet of the wilderness, our focus sharpened. With the immediate threat of discovery momentarily abated, we could think more clearly. "The manifest confirms the who and the how," Thorne said, pacing in front of the fire, his shadow looming large on the log walls. "Alvaro Smith, formerly de Santa Ana y Garcia, was the operative. Smuggled in by Smythe, set up in California. But the why is still elusive. Why would he do it? Why betray his own uncle, his country? It couldn't have just been for money. A man like that, from a powerful family, his loyalty would have been ideological, deeply ingrained." I stared at the map, at the symbol of the eye. The note said, "God forgive us the means." That suggests that Scott, or someone involved, had reservations. That the method of turning Alvaro was ugly. Something that would require divine forgiveness. Thorne stopped pacing. Coercion. It had to be coercion. But what kind of leverage could Scott possibly have had over a young aristocrat in Mexico City from his position in Washington? A new idea, dark and unsettling, began to form in my mind, piecing together fragments we had overlooked. What if it wasn't leverage Scott created? What if it was leverage he discovered? What if Alvaro had a secret of his own, a secret so damaging that Scott's agents found out about it and used it to blackmail him into betrayal? Thorne's eyes widened. A scandal. Something that would destroy him. Something even more important to him than his loyalty to his uncle or his country. He rushed to the bookshelves, his fingers tracing the spines until he found a heavy, leather-bound volume titled Private Lives of the Mexican Gentry, 1820-1850. It was an obscure, gossipy history based on diaries and letters, the kind of source mainstream academics dismissed but Thorne devoured. He brought it to the table, dust flying, and began flipping through the pages with a frantic energy. Santa Ana, his court. There were always rumors of illicit affairs, duels, secret families. He scanned the index, his finger running down the entries. Then he stopped. His breath caught. "Leo," he whispered, his voice filled with a kind of horrified awe. He pointed to a short entry. It was a footnote citing a letter from a Spanish diplomat stationed in Mexico City in 1846. The diplomat wrote about the scandalous behavior of the young bloods in Santa Ana's circle, and mentioned in passing a rumor about his favored nephew, Alvaro. The rumor was that Alvaro, a passionate and romantic young man, had fallen deeply in love with a woman far beneath his station, not just a commoner, but a woman who was already married to one of Santa Ana's most trusted and notoriously jealous generals. The affair, the diplomat noted, was an open secret, a ticking time bomb that could detonate at any moment. Thorne and I looked at each other, the same horrific understanding dawning on us both. Scott hadn't offered Alvaro gold or a new life. He had offered him salvation. Scott's agents had discovered the affair. They had gone to Alvaro and presented him with an ultimatum: cooperate with us, become our eyes and ears, and we will ensure you and your lover are protected, given a new life far away from the general's wrath. Refuse, and we will deliver proof of the affair directly to your uncle and the cuckolded general. The choice was between certain, brutal death for himself and the woman he loved, or the betrayal of his nation. Operation Serpent's Tooth wasn't just about military strategy. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a cruel exploitation of a young man's heart. The thankless child was a man trapped, a man who chose love over loyalty, who was forced to rot his own family from within to save the one thing that mattered to him. The phrase, "God forgive us the means," took on a new, profoundly tragic weight. Scott had known he was destroying a man's soul to win his war. The victory was indeed won before the first shot was fired, because the first shot was a bullet of blackmail fired straight into the heart of the enemy's command. We had uncovered the terrible, human truth at the center of the secret. And understanding that truth made the danger we were in feel even more acute. The descendants of Alvaro Smith weren't just protecting a shameful source of wealth. They were protecting the story of their founder's profound weakness, his tragic compromise. It was a story of love and betrayal so intimate and damning that its exposure would be a humiliation beyond measure. The pale-eyed man wasn't just a guardian. He was an eraser, tasked with wiping this stain from his family's history forever. As night fell completely, enveloping the cabin in an inky blackness broken only by the firelight, the silence outside felt no longer peaceful, but watchful. The wind sounded like whispering voices, and every crack from the cooling fireplace made me jump. We had pieced together the core of the secret, but in doing so, we had made ourselves the greatest threat to a family that had already proven it would do anything to keep its past buried. We were safe for now, in our mountain fortress, but the war was far from over. In fact, by understanding the true stakes, we had just escalated it to a level we could scarcely imagine. The escalation of the war to a level we could scarcely imagine was not a sudden, dramatic explosion of violence but a slow, chilling realization that seeped into the cabin's quiet solitude like the frigid mountain air. A dawning comprehension that the secret we now held was not just a historical fact but the very bedrock of a modern-day empire of influence, an empire that would not hesitate to use all of its considerable, shadowy power to ensure that the tragic, blackmailed compromise of its founder, Alvaro Smith, remained forever entombed in the past, and that we, two isolated historians in a remote cabin, were not merely inconvenient researchers but existential threats to be eliminated with the same cold efficiency that Winfield Scott had displayed when he orchestrated the original operation. The crackling fire in the hearth, which had initially provided comfort, now seemed to cast dancing, malevolent shadows on the log walls, shadows that twisted into the shapes of accusing faces and clutching hands, and the absolute silence of the wilderness outside, once a buffer from the pursuing world, now felt like a vast, soundless auditorium where our every whisper, our every rustle of paper, was amplified, potentially broadcasting our presence to unseen listeners. Professor Thorne, his face looking ancient and gaunt in the flickering firelight, had fallen into a deep, troubled silence after we had articulated the horrifying theory of blackmail, his eyes fixed on the glowing embers as if searching for an answer in the primordial heart of the fire. The romantic tragedy at the core of Operation Serpent's Tooth had clearly affected him on a profound level, stripping away the thrill of the historical chase and replacing it with the grim weight of a human tragedy we were now responsible for exposing. "They will have resources we can't even conceive of, Leo," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the fire's pop and hiss. "If this family has maintained this secret for this long, building a financial dynasty on its foundation, their security apparatus will be private, global, and utterly ruthless. They won't send the police. They'll send cleaners. People who specialize in making problems disappear without a trace. Our disappearance in these mountains would be a simple statistic, a tragic hiking accident." His words hung in the air, solid and terrifying. The pale-eyed man from the attic was no longer just a menacing figure. He was the likely tip of a vast, hidden iceberg, a professional operative employed by a family with the wealth to command an entire army of such men. Our only advantage was our isolation and the fact that we, for the moment, held the primary physical evidence, the map itself. But that advantage was fragile. "We can't just hide here forever," I said, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast, dark silence. "We have to do something with what we know. We have to get the truth out." Thorne nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from the fire to the map on the table, where the drawn eye seemed to stare back at us with a knowing, mournful intensity. "We need to create a dead man's switch," he said, the term sounding chillingly literal in our context. "A way to disseminate everything we've discovered, the map, the manifest, our analysis, to a wide audience instantly, in the event that something happens to us. That is the only way to ensure our safety. The moment the secret is public, we cease to be a threat worth eliminating." It was a logical, cold-blooded strategy, but implementing it from our off-grid sanctuary was a monumental challenge. We had no internet, no cell service. The only link to the outside world was the antique rotary phone on the wall. "We can't transmit data over that," I said, pointing to the phone. "It would take forever to read all this to someone, and we can't trust anyone not connected to this. We don't need to transmit the data now." Thorn countered, a spark of his old cunning returning to his eyes. We need to prepare the package. We need to digitize everything to the highest quality possible, and then we need to find a way to physically transport that data to a safe third party with instructions to publish it if they don't hear from us by a specific deadline. It was a race against time, a desperate gamble. We spent the next several hours in a frenetic, focused burst of activity. Using the cameras on our phones, we took hundreds of high-resolution photographs of the map from every angle, capturing every crease, every faint pencil mark, every nuance of the faded ink. We photographed the relevant pages from the books we had brought, the passenger manifest for the Pacific Star, the land deed for Alvaro Smith. We typed up a detailed narrative, compiling all our findings and our chilling hypothesis about the blackmail of Alvaro, creating a document that was part historical analysis and part last testament. We stored all of this, the images, the documents, on 2 separate USB thumb drives that Thorn produced from his satchel. One drive would stay with us. The other had to be delivered to someone we could trust implicitly, someone outside the academic world who would not be intimidated and would follow our instructions to the letter. The problem was neither of us knew such a person. Our world was the university, a place of gossiping colleagues and ambitious rivals. As the first light of a new day began to gray the windows, the problem of the second drive remained unsolved, a ticking clock in our pocket. We were exhausted, running on nerves and caffeine, but sleep was impossible. The plan felt flimsy, a thread of hope against the granite wall of the opposition we faced. It was then that we heard it. A sound that did not belong to the mountain. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of an engine. A vehicle, moving slowly, carefully, along the main dirt road that snaked through the valley below. It was too early for loggers, too remote for casual tourists. Thorn and I froze, our eyes locking in a shared moment of pure, undiluted panic. He moved to the window, keeping to the side, and peered out through a narrow gap in the heavy curtains into the pre-dawn gloom. I stood rigid by the table, my hand instinctively closing around the USB drive in my pocket, the solid piece of plastic feeling like the only tangible thing in a world that was collapsing around us. The sound of the engine grew closer, not heading up towards our specific track, but stopping. Then silence. A silence more terrifying than the engine noise. They were down there. They had found our general location. It was only a matter of time before they began systematically checking every side road, every hunting path. Our isolation was now our prison. "They're here," Thorn whispered, his face ashen as he turned from the window. "They must have tracked my car. I was careful, but they have resources." The fragile sense of security the cabin had provided shattered into a million pieces. We were cornered. The war was no longer a theoretical conflict of research and secrets. It was here, at our doorstep, in the form of a silent vehicle parked in the valley below, its occupants undoubtedly armed with more than just historical curiosity. We had nowhere to run. The wilderness that surrounded us was vast and unforgiving. Without supplies and knowledge of the terrain, we would be dead in a day. Our only hope was the dead man's switch, but we had failed to activate it. The USB drive in my pocket was useless without a messenger. In that moment of sheer, paralyzing terror, a desperate, crazy idea flashed into my mind. It was a long shot, a gamble on human decency that felt naive against the ruthless professionalism of our pursuers. But it was the only shot we had. "The ranger station." I breathed, my voice tight. "There's a Forest Service ranger station about 10 miles back down the main road. Remember we passed it? They have a radio. A link to the outside world. If we can get there, if we can get the drive to a ranger, explain the situation, it's a government employee. They can't just ignore a plea for help. They could contact the FBI, someone with real authority." Thorn stared at me, his mind racing, weighing the insane risks. The cabin was a defensible position, but a siege would only end one way. A desperate sprint through the woods to the ranger station was suicidal, but it was the only move that offered a chance, however slim, of survival and exposing the truth. The sound of a second vehicle, joining the first down on the main road, decided it for us. They were reinforcing. They were preparing to move in. "We go," Thorn said, his voice firm with a sudden, decisive energy. "Now." while it's still dark. We take the map, the drives, nothing else. We go on foot through the trees. It's our only chance. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic motion. We shoved the precious map into its tube and into my backpack. I secured the USB drives in a zippered pocket. We didn't bother to extinguish the fire. Its dying light might make them think we were still inside, buying us precious minutes. Thorn grabbed the heavy, wooden walking stick from by the door, a pathetic weapon against firearms, but it was something. Then, we slipped out the back door of the cabin, into the biting cold and the deep, concealing shadows of the pre-dawn forest. The path to the ranger station was a faint, overgrown trail that Thorn knew from his solitary hikes. We moved as quickly and as quietly as we could, our breath pluming in the frigid air, every snap of a twig under our feet sounding like a thunderclap in the immense silence. The war for the secret had left the archive and the cabin behind. It was now a primal chase through a wilderness as old as time, a race between two historians carrying the burden of a terrible truth and the faceless, modern heirs of a betrayal who were determined to bury that truth, and us along with it, in the cold, unforgiving ground of the mountain. The race through the cold, unforgiving ground of the mountain was a brutal, gasping ordeal that stripped away all pretense of civilization, reducing Professor Thorn and me to nothing more than two terrified animals fleeing through a labyrinth of ancient pines and jagged granite under a sky that was slowly shifting from deepest black to a murky, pre-dawn gray, a light that did little to illuminate the path but enough to reveal the treacherous, uneven terrain that threatened to twist an ankle or send us tumbling down a slope with every frantic, stumbling step. The air was knife-sharp in our lungs, and the silence of the forest, which had felt so watchful in the cabin, was now a cacophony of our own panicked breathing, the pounding of our hearts, and the relentless, crushing awareness that somewhere behind us, men with cold, professional efficiency were undoubtedly already discovering our abandoned cabin and beginning their own, far more skilled pursuit. Thorn, despite his age, moved with a surprising, desperate agility, his knowledge of the trail our only slender advantage, his form a dark, lurching shape ahead of me, the rhythmic thump of his walking stick against the hard earth a metronome counting down the seconds we had left. I followed, my backpack with its precious, damning contents slamming against my back with every jolting stride, my muscles screaming in protest, my mind a whirling vortex of fear and a single, focused imperative, reach the ranger station. The 10 miles Thorn had mentioned felt like 1,000. Every glance over my shoulder into the deep, shifting shadows between the trees seemed to reveal a moving shape. Every rustle of an animal in the undergrowth was the sound of a boot crushing a leaf, and the growing light only served to make us feel more exposed, more visible against the stark landscape. The plan to appeal to a forest ranger, which had seemed like a desperate gamble in the relative safety of the cabin, now felt like the naive fantasy of a child, a pathetic hope held against the certainty of professional hunters. What if the ranger was in on it? What if the family's influence reached even into the remote outposts of the government? The paranoia was a poison in my veins, but it was also a fuel, pushing my exhausted body beyond what I thought were its limits. After what felt like an eternity of running, the sky began to lighten significantly, turning a pale, washed-out blue, and the trail started to descend more steeply, a sign that we were moving out of the high wilderness and towards the area where the ranger station was located. Thorn, his breath now coming in ragged, wheezing gasps, held up a hand, signaling for us to stop. We crouched behind a large, moss-covered boulder, listening. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the high branches and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Then we heard it. Faint, but clear in the thin mountain air, the sound of a vehicle door slamming shut, followed by another. It came from the direction of the ranger station. My heart leaped, a flicker of hope amidst the terror. We were close. But Thorn's face was grim. He held a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with warning. He pointed ahead, through a break in the trees. From our vantage point, we could see the roof of the ranger station, a simple, low building with a radio antenna sprouting from its roof. And parked in the small gravel lot in front of it were two vehicles. One was a familiar green Forest Service truck. The other was a large, black SUV, its dark, polished surface looking alien and menacing in the rustic setting. The hope that had flickered in my chest died instantly, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. They were already here. They had anticipated our move. The pale-eyed man and his team had not only found the cabin, they had cordoned off the only viable exit, the only source of help. We were trapped in a tightening noose. We watched, frozen in horror, as the door of the ranger station opened. A man in the familiar green and gray uniform of a forest ranger emerged, followed by the tall, broad-shouldered figure of the pale-eyed man. They were talking. The ranger was nodding, pointing back up the road towards the direction of Thorne's cabin. He was cooperating. He was giving them information. The family's reach was absolute. They had neutralized the authorities before we could even reach them. The pale-eyed man nodded, said something to the ranger, and then gestured to two other men who had gotten out of the SUV. They were dressed in dark, tactical-looking clothing, a stark contrast to the ranger's uniform. They began unloading equipment from the back of the vehicle, not guns, but something almost as frightening, high-tech tracking gear, antennas, and what looked like drones. They weren't just going to hunt us on foot. They were going to use technology to sweep the area with brutal, impersonal efficiency. We were not just outnumbered, we were outclassed in every conceivable way. Thorne pulled me back behind the boulder, his face a mask of despair and fury. "It's over," he whispered, the words barely audible. "They've sealed us off. The ranger, he's either one of them or he's been convinced we're dangerous fugitives. There's no help there." The reality of our situation was absolute. We were alone in the wilderness, with highly trained trackers and their technology between us and any hope of escape. The mountains that had seemed like a hiding place were now a vast, open-air prison, and the hunt was about to begin in earnest. The weight of the backpack, of the map and the USB drives felt like it was crushing me into the ground. We had uncovered one of the greatest secrets in American history, and it was going to die with us in these woods, lost forever. The tragedy of Alvaro and his lost love would remain a hidden shame, and the victory of Winfield Scott would stand unchallenged, a monument built on a foundation of blackmail and a murder that was about to happen a century and a half later. As we crouched there, paralyzed by hopelessness, I noticed something Thorne, in his focus on the station, had missed. A few hundred yards to our left, away from the station and the main road, the land fell away sharply into a deep, heavily wooded ravine. A small, fast-moving stream was visible at the bottom, its white water catching the morning light. And following the course of that stream was a thin, almost invisible line, a railway track. It was an old, narrow-gauge line, used decades ago for logging, now mostly abandoned, but according to a map I'd seen in the cabin, it still saw occasional use for transporting maintenance crews or seasonal workers. It was a thread, a desperate, crazy thread, but it was a direction they might not expect. It led away from the roads, away from civilization, deeper into the wilderness, but eventually it had to come out somewhere. It was a path of absolute last resort. I grabbed Thorne's arm and pointed, my voice a frantic, hushed whisper. "The railway. The old logging line. It follows the stream. If we can get down there, we can follow the tracks. They'll be looking for us on the trails, on the roads. They won't expect us to take the railway." Thorne stared at the ravine, then back at the ranger station, where the trackers were now fanning out, beginning their systematic search. His eyes held a flicker of the old fire, the refusal to surrender that had defined his academic life. It was an insane plan. The descent into the ravine was steep and dangerous. The railway might lead nowhere. We had no food, no water beyond what we could drink from the stream. But it was a move. It was action, as opposed to waiting here to be found. He gave a sharp, single nod. "All right, Leo. The railway it is. But we have to move now. And we have to be like smoke." The descent was a nightmarish scramble down a near vertical slope, grabbing onto saplings and exposed roots to keep from falling, our clothes getting torn by jagged rocks and thorny bushes. We half slid, half fell the last 20 feet, landing in a heap on the gravel embankment next to the railway track. The sound of the rushing stream was loud now, a roaring that would help cover any noise we made. We looked at each other, bruised, breathless, but alive. The tracks, rusted and weed-choked, stretched away in both directions, a thin metal line through the deep green gloom of the ravine. We had no idea which way to go. Choosing east on a pure gut feeling, we began to run, not on the treacherous, uneven ties, but on the gravel bed next to the tracks, our footsteps muffled by the stones and the sound of the water. We were no longer historians. We were fugitives, running for our lives along a forgotten ribbon of steel, carrying a truth that was too heavy to bear but too important to drop. The war for the secret had entered its final, most desperate phase, a flight along the edge of oblivion, with hunters at our backs and the ghosts of the past whispering from the map in my pack, urging us forward into the unknown. The flight along the edge of oblivion, with the ghosts of the past whispering from the map in my pack, became a brutal test of endurance that blurred the line between minutes and hours, a desperate, stumbling marathon along the rusted ribbon of the abandoned railway track where every labored breath was a gasp against the crushing weight of exhaustion, and every pounding heartbeat was a drumbeat counting down the moments until our hunter's technology would inevitably pinpoint our location in the deep, concealing gloom of the ravine. The initial burst of adrenaline that had fueled our frantic descent and the first mile of our run had long since burned away, leaving behind a deep, muscular agony that turned each step into a conscious act of will. Professor Thorne, despite his incredible resilience, was fading fast, his face a ghastly gray, his breathing a worrisome, wheezing rattle that spoke of lungs pushed far beyond their limit. I stayed close to him, one hand occasionally reaching out to steady him when he stumbled on the loose gravel, the other clutching the strap of my backpack as if it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The roaring of the stream was a constant, deafening companion, a white noise curtain that isolated us in our own private world of fear but also, we hoped, masked the sound of our passage from any electronic ears that might be sweeping the area from above. The ravine walls rose steeply on either side, a fortress of rock and dense pine that blocked out much of the growing morning light, casting the railway cut in a perpetual, damp twilight. It was a landscape of profound isolation, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tunnel leading to an uncertain fate, with no visible exit. We had been running, walking, and stumbling for what felt like an eternity when Thorne finally collapsed against a mossy railroad tie, his body shuddering with the effort to draw a breath. "Leo! I can't! I need a moment!" he gasped, his words broken and thin. I slumped down next to him, my own body screaming in gratitude for the stop. I pulled a water bottle from my pack, and we passed it back and forth, drinking greedily from the icy, clear water of the stream I had scooped into it during a brief pause. The cold liquid was a lifeline, but it did little to quell the gnawing hunger in our stomachs or the deeper, more profound fear in our souls. As we sat there in the thundering silence of the stream, the full hopelessness of our situation descended upon me. We were two unarmed academics, lost in the wilderness, pursued by a small army of professionals. The USB drive in my pocket felt like a cruel joke. What was the point of carrying the truth if there was no one left to tell it to? The railway might lead to a dead end, a forgotten terminus in the middle of nowhere. Or it might simply go on for 50 miles. We would never make it. Thorne seemed to read my thoughts. His eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, still held a fierce, intellectual light. "We have to think, Leo," he rasped. "Running is not a strategy. It's a delay. We need a destination. This railway was built for a purpose. It must lead to something. A logging camp, a mine, a connection to a main line. We need to remember the geography." He closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in concentration, accessing the vast mental map of the region he carried in his mind. "The main transcontinental line, it runs north of here, through the pass. This logging spur, if my memory serves, it was built to haul timber down to a mill town called Seneca Falls. But Seneca Falls was abandoned decades ago when the mill closed. A dead end." My heart sank. But then Thorne's eyes snapped open. "But the spur wouldn't just stop at a ghost town. The timber had to get to the main line. There must be a junction, a connection point where this spur met the main railway. If we can find that junction, we might find something. A maintenance shed, a working line, even a road." It was a thread, thinner than the one we were running on, but it was a purpose. Seneca Falls. A ghost town. It sounded like the end of the line in every sense, but the possibility of a junction beyond it was the only flicker of hope we had. We forced ourselves to our feet, our bodies protesting violently, and continued our grim journey east. The landscape began to change subtly. The ravine widened, and signs of old human activity started to appear. Crumbling concrete foundations almost swallowed by ferns, the skeletal remains of old logging equipment being slowly digested by the forest, and a general sense of nature reclaiming what was once taken from it. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp decay and pine. And then we saw it. Through a break in the trees, a collection of dilapidated wooden structures emerged from the mist that clung to the valley floor. Seneca Falls. It was a ghost town in the truest sense, a place where time had stopped. The buildings were sagging and roofless, their windows like empty eye sockets. A large, rusted water tower leaned at a precarious angle. The railway track ran straight through the center of the town, ending abruptly at the towering, silent wall of a long-closed sawmill. Our hearts, which had leapt at the sight of civilization, sank again. It was a dead end. Just as despair was about to consume us completely, I noticed something. The tracks didn't actually end. They curved sharply just before the sawmill, disappearing behind a thick grove of young alder trees. We followed the curve, pushing through the damp, clinging branches, and there it was. The junction. It was exactly as Thorne had predicted. Our spur line met a larger, better maintained set of tracks. This was the main line, and it showed signs of recent use. The rails were shiny from friction, and the gravel bed was clear of major weeds. But there was no station, no shed, no sign of life. Just the two sets of tracks converging in the middle of nowhere. We stood there, at the crossroads of hope and desolation, unsure which way to turn. Left or right? North towards the pass, or south towards, we didn't know what. As we debated in hushed, frantic tones, a sound began to grow in the distance, a low, rhythmic vibration that we felt through the soles of our feet before we heard it with our ears. It was a sound that was utterly out of place in this forgotten landscape, a sound that belonged to the world we had left behind. It was the sound of a diesel engine. A train. We looked at each other, our eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a wild, impossible hope. A train on the main line. It was either our salvation or our doom. If it was a freight train, it might be slow enough to board. It could carry us out of the mountains, to a city, to safety. But if our pursuers had anticipated this, if they had contacts on the railway, it could be a trap rolling straight towards us. The sound grew louder, a deep-throated rumble that echoed through the valley. We had seconds to decide. Hiding was the safe option. But safe would mean staying in the wilderness to be hunted down. Boarding the train was a monumental risk, a leap into the unknown. Thorne looked at me, his face etched with a lifetime of curiosity and a refusal to surrender. He gave a single, sharp nod towards the tracks. It was a gamble, a crazy, desperate gamble. We scrambled up the gravel embankment and pressed ourselves flat against the cold, hard metal of the rail, hidden from view by the tall grass at the edge of the track bed. The roar was deafening now. A bright headlight pierced the morning mist, and then the locomotive thundered into view, a massive, grimy beast of steel and power, pulling the long line of freight cars behind it. It was moving, but not at full speed. The gradient of the pass meant it was laboring, its pace slow and heavy. This was our chance. As the locomotive roared past, a wall of noise and wind, we waited, our hearts in our mouths. Then came the cars. Grain cars, boxcars, flatbeds. We needed an open car, something we could climb into. The first few were sealed tight. Then, a flatbed carrying. It was now or never. I looked at Thorne. He nodded, his jaw set. As the open door came abreast of us, we broke from our hiding place and ran alongside the train, matching its pace for a few terrifying strides. I grabbed the cold, rusty edge of the door and pulled, my muscles screaming. It slid open another foot with a screech of metal that was lost in the train's roar. I boosted Thorne up first, heaving his frail body into the dark interior, then scrambled in after him, collapsing onto the grimy, wooden floor as the train carried us away from Seneca Falls, away from the ghost town and the hunters, and into the next terrifying, unknown chapter of our flight. We were on the run, inside the belly of the beast, hurtling towards an uncertain future. The secret of Serpent's Tooth still clutched tightly in our grasp, its weight now heavier than ever. The uncertain future we were hurtling towards inside the grimy, rattling belly of the freight car was a void of absolute blackness and disorientation, a sensory deprivation chamber on wheels where the only constants were the deafening rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the violent, jerking sway of the car that threw us against its splintered wooden walls, and the profound, dust-choked darkness that was so complete it felt like a physical substance pressing in on us, a tangible manifestation of the unknown fate that lay down the tracks. For the first hour, Professor Thorne and I could do nothing but lie where we had collapsed on the filthy floor, our bodies battered and exhausted, our lungs burning from the effort of the chase and now filling with the thick, particulate air of the boxcar, a foul mixture of ancient grain dust, diesel fumes seeping through the cracks, and the faint, metallic scent of rust. The initial, wild surge of adrenaline that had propelled us onto the moving train had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache and a creeping, claustrophobic terror that was magnified by the absolute blackness and the knowledge that we were now completely at the mercy of this mechanical beast, hurtling through a landscape we could not see towards a destination we did not know. The map tube in my backpack dug into my spine, a constant, painful reminder of the cursed treasure that had brought us to this point, and the USB drives in my pocket felt like twin stones of responsibility, their digital truth now our only currency in a world that was trying to kill us. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the profound gloom, faint slivers of gray light began to resolve themselves, thin cracks in the boxcar's walls and around the edges of the heavy sliding door, which we had managed to pull mostly shut behind us, leaving only a narrow gap for air. These slivers shifted and danced, casting fleeting, phantom-like illuminations on the interior of the car, revealing a space that was empty save for a few scattered piles of rotting hay and the detritus of countless previous cargoes. The floor was gritty with dirt and splintered wood, and the air was freezing cold, the wind whistling through the cracks with an icy bite that seeped through our thin jackets. Thorne, lying a few feet away, began to cough, a deep, racking sound that echoed horribly in the metal confines of the car. The flight and the cold air had taken a severe toll on him. I crawled over to him, my own muscles protesting every movement. "Thorne? Are you all right?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the roar of the train. He waved a weak hand, trying to sit up. "I'll be fine, Leo. Just need to catch my breath." But he didn't sound fine. He sounded frail and old, a stark contrast to the fiery intellectual he had been just hours before. The reality of our situation was bleak. We were fugitives, cold, hungry, dehydrated, and injured, trapped in a metal box speeding through the mountains. We had no idea if the train was heading north towards Reno and civilization, or south into the even more remote deserts of Nevada. We had no water, no food, and no way to communicate with the outside world. Our desperate gamble had saved us from the immediate pursuit in the mountains, but it might have only delayed the inevitable, trading a death in the wilderness for a slower, more drawn-out demise inside this rolling coffin. We needed a plan. We couldn't just ride this train to its final destination, wherever that was, and walk out into a rail yard, where security would surely be waiting for transients. The family that was hunting us had proven its reach. They would have alerts out at every major station, every police department. We had to get off the train before it reached a populated area. But where? And how? Jumping from a moving train was a sure way to break bones or worse, especially in our weakened state. As the train carried on through the day, the slivers of light brightening and then slowly fading again as evening approached, we huddled together for warmth, our minds racing. Thorne, drawing on some deep reserve of strength, began to strategize. "The train will have to slow down for grades, for curves, perhaps for signals," he said, his voice a thin rasp. "That will be our chance. We need to be ready. We need to look for a place that is remote, but not utterly desolate. Somewhere near a small town, perhaps, where we can find help without immediately walking into a police station." It was a thin plan, but it was all we had. We took turns peering out through the crack in the door, watching the world fly by in a dizzying blur. The high pine forests of the Sierras gradually gave way to a drier, more rugged landscape of scrubland and canyons. We were descending the eastern slope of the mountains. This was good. It meant we were moving away from the immediate hunt, but it also meant we were entering a vast, empty region. Hours passed, marked only by the gnawing hunger in our stomachs and the deepening cold. The thirst was becoming a serious problem. Our mouths were dry and cottony, and the dust in the air only made it worse. I found myself staring at the rusty walls, fantasizing about water. The situation was becoming critical. Just as despair was beginning to win its battle against hope, the train's rhythm changed. The constant, high-speed clatter began to slow. The brakes hissed, and the cars jolted and groaned as the train decelerated. We scrambled to the door and peered out. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and in the fading light, we could see we were approaching the outskirts of a small, dusty town nestled in a wide valley. The sign on a water tower was faded, but we could just make out the name. Sandy Crossing. It was a handful of streets, a few lights twinkling in the dusk. More importantly, the train was slowing to a crawl, perhaps for a signal or a crew change. This was it. Our chance. Now, Leo! Now! Thorn urged. I shoved the heavy door open wider. The ground was moving past at a jogging pace, still dangerously fast. But it was now or never. I threw my backpack out first, hoping it wouldn't get caught under the wheels. Then I helped Thorn to the edge. On 3! I yelled over the noise. 1, 2, 3! We jumped together, tumbling into the gravel and scrub beside the tracks. The impact was brutal, a jarring, rolling crash that tore at my clothes and scraped skin from my hands and knees. I came to a stop, gasping, my body a symphony of new pains. I looked over frantically. Thorn was lying a few yards away, not moving. I crawled to him, my heart in my throat. Thorn! Thorn, are you okay? He groaned, rolling onto his side. He was alive, but he was hurt. His face was pale, and he was clutching his ankle. Twisted it, I think, he gasped. But I'll manage. The train rumbled past us, its slow, indifferent bulk eventually giving way to the caboose, which disappeared into the growing darkness, leaving us alone in the silence of the desert evening. We had escaped the moving prison, but we were now in Sandy Crossing, injured, exhausted, and desperately exposed. We were in the open, with no resources, in a town that was little more than a dot on the map. We had to find shelter, water, and food, and we had to do it without drawing any attention. The war for the secret had followed us down from the mountains, and the next battle was about to begin on the dusty, anonymous streets of a forgotten railroad town, where every light in a window felt like a searching eye and every passing car could be carrying our executioners. We were free from the train, but we were still a long, long way from safe.